Hello and welcome to the HistoryNetwork.org podcast. If you would like to become a patron of the podcast, we would love you to, and you can do so at patreon.com/the History Network. Thank you to all our patrons who make this podcast possible. The HistoryNetwork.org podcast, season 38, episode 5, Valour Lost, part 3. George Ravenhill. George Ravenhill joined the 1st Battalion of the Royal Scots Fusiliers when he was 17 in 1889. He spent 6 years in India before transferring to the 2nd Battalion in South Africa during the Second Boer War. There, at the Battle of Colenso on December 15, 1899, Ravenhill made several forays to assist the artillery officers in withdrawing the guns of the 2 batteries of the Royal Field Artillery after all their crews had been killed. He was wounded during this action, shot through the forearm. He was gazetted for his Victoria Cross in June 1901. Ravenhill became the last man to forfeit a Victoria Cross in 1908 when he was convicted of the theft of some iron and could not pay the 10-shilling fine. The pension he was entitled to as a recipient of the Victoria Cross was also revoked. He fell into poverty, and 3 of his children were removed from his care to be fostered in the United States. He died in Birmingham in 1921 at the age of only 49. In addition to these recipients whose actions warranted the forfeiture of their awards, several recipients engaged in questionable criminal or nefarious activity, but, for one reason or another, did not forfeit their awards. Even at the original investiture in June 1857, one recipient, Private William Stanlake of the Coldstream Guards, due to receive his Victoria Cross at the inaugural investiture from Queen Victoria herself in Hyde Park, was barred from attending the ceremony because he was being punished at the barracks for theft. This act was not enough to see him forfeit his award, however, despite it being enough for others to forfeit their awards later. Stoker William Johnston performed his act of bravery in August 1854 amongst the first men gazetted for a Victoria Cross in February 1857, and amongst the earliest actions recognised. The first had taken place in June 1854. He was also not present at the inaugural investiture in June 1857, already being on duty elsewhere in the Caribbean. Johnston is a figure shrouded in mystery to this day. He may have been Swedish and named Johansson, his name being anglicised as Johnston. The name he wrote on his enlistment papers for the Royal Navy was John Johnston, and he claimed he was born in Hanover. It was his knowledge of the Swedish language, however, which led to his being selected for the action which led to his Victoria Cross. Admiral Charles Napier's Baltic fleet had trouble recruiting enough men, and so enlistment was opened up to foreign nationals from Stockholm. Johnston was probably one of these, although why he would claim to be Hanoverian remains a mystery. Johnston was gazetted as William Johnston, but there was no one aboard the HMS Arrogant by that name. At least 2 other officers in the Royal Navy at the time were named William Johnston, which may explain the confusion. His medal is recorded as being dispatched to the Royal Navy via registered post, but it would seem that, at the time of the investiture, he was serving on HMS Brunswick and died of a self-inflicted wound on August 20, 1857, cutting his own throat after an altercation where he attacked another sailor with a knife. Other Victoria Cross recipients in the West Indies who were invested with their medals in early August 1857, Hugh Rowlands in Barbados on August 5th and Ambrose Madden in Jamaica on August 7th. Therefore Johnston most probably had received his Victoria Cross at the time of his death, although this is not how it had been reported, nor how it was reported at the time. Johnston was buried at sea in the West Indies. Things may not be that simple, however. HMS Brunswick was in the Mediterranean until October 1857, when she was posted to the West Indies. It would seem that Johnston was not on the Brunswick, but one of the other vessels in the West Indies, since that is where he was buried at sea. What is more, he probably had received his medal before the altercation which led to his death, and his crime was probably enough to warrant a forfeiture of his medal. The medal itself is now in the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles County. It was donated to the museum in 1958 as part of the Robert B. Honeyman Jr. collection, although how it became to be in that collection is a mystery. Thomas Flynn, the co-youngest recipient of the Victoria Cross at age 15 years 3 months, was awarded the Victoria Cross as a drummer boy at Cawnpore, India in November 1857. Later he fell on hard times and ended up in the Athlone workhouse. His case was brought before the House of Commons to request that his £10 annuity could be increased. The response is telling. Having been entered in the defaulter book 47 times and tried by court-martial 15 times, the poor man is a victim to drink to such an extent that when he had the control of his money, he only left the workhouse for the purpose of drinking up his annuity as soon as received. And yet for none of these crimes nor convictions was it suggested that Flynn forfeit his award. Regardless of later circumstances, these men's acts of bravery still deserve attention and praise. Examining the history of the Victoria Cross recipients, however, there have been several other recipients whose later actions may have been less than honourable. These incidents stretch back to the very first medals invested in 1857 and yet did not result in the forfeiture of the award. Several winners of the Victoria Cross fell on hard times subsequent to their awards and succumbed to the temptation of drink, violence, or crime, found themselves in less than honourable circumstances. The idea of forfeiture changed in 1920. That year George V wrote to his private secretary, Arthur Bigg, Lord Stamfordham, and he believed that recipients of the Victoria Cross should never have that honour taken away from them. The King feels so strongly that, no matter the crime committed by anyone on whom the V.C. has been conferred, decoration should not be forfeited. Even were a V.C. to be sentenced to be hanged for murder, he should be allowed to wear his V.C. on the scaffold. Since that time, no recipient has forfeited the award, regardless of what they may have done subsequent to it. Although the most recent forfeiture occurred in 1908, the most recent correspondence with the King and his private secretary had been from Collis's sister. A Gazette entry of June 18, 1920, issued by Churchill, reiterated the main points of the Victoria Cross: how it should appear, only a red riband, no longer a blue one for naval Victoria Crosses; how it should be worn, and to whom it should be issued. This entry reiterated that the cross shall only be awarded for the most conspicuous bravery, or some daring or pre-eminent act of valour or self-sacrifice, or extreme devotion to duty in the presence of the enemy. George V, however, now added a notable amendment that it is ordained that the cross may be awarded posthumously. Previously this had caused several headaches for acts of bravery which had resulted in the man's death, or those who had subsequently died before they could be awarded or gazetted for their medal. One reason for this striking amendment was that 1/4 of the Victoria Crosses awarded during the First World War were posthumous, but there had previously been no explicit statement that such acts of bravery were eligible. Whilst undertaking this reframing of the medal, however, the following point was still included: in order to make such additional provision as shall effectually maintain pure this most honourable distinction, it is ordained that if any person on whom such distinction shall be conferred be convicted of treason, cowardice, felony, or of any infamous crime, or if he or she be accused of any such offence and doth not after a reasonable time surrender himself or herself, to be tried for the same, his or her name shall, by an especial warrant under our royal sign mutual, forthwith be erased from the registry of individuals upon whom the said decoration shall have been conferred, and the pension conferred under Rules 10 and 11 shall cease and termine from the date of such warrant. It is hereby further declared that we, our heirs and successors, shall be the sole judges of the circumstance demanding such expulsion. Moreover, we shall at all times have power to restore such persons as may at any time have been expelled, both to the enjoyment of the decoration and pension, and notice thereof of expulsion or restoration in every case shall be published in the London Gazette. This remains the official position of the Victoria Cross on forfeiture and cancellation of the award, although no case has been brought since. We can also note here the inclusion of she. George V, for the first time here, included the provision that women serving in the armed forces could be awarded the Victoria Cross. No woman has been awarded the medal in the century since. There is no evidence, however, that the position outlined by the King in 1920 related to Collis's case, even though Winston Churchill opposed of the cancellation of Collis's forfeiture. He did concede and had the royal warrant amended to apply the forfeiture only for treason, cowardice, felony, or any infamous crime. This discussion may perhaps have come up as part of the slew of World War I Victoria Crosses. The award was given 628 times during that conflict. What is more, the names of those who forfeited their medals were later reinstated in the register of the Victoria Cross, as Collis's sister had requested, although with a note telling of their forfeiture. Since his loss of a defamation case against several news outlets, the case of Ben Robert Smith has been reported and re-reported all over the world, even making it to the Wall Street Journal. There have been cries on both sides that he should be stripped of his Victoria Cross, and his medals and uniform should be removed from the display at the Australian War Memorial in Canberra, all the way through to those who argue that our heroes should be sacrosanct and his heroism should not be impugned. Of course, the defamation was a civil trial and not even a criminal one. Robert Smith had not been formally accused or charged with any crime, let alone put on trial for anything. If those things were to happen and he was to be found guilty, the question remains, should he forfeit his Victoria Cross? According to the position of King George V in 1920, which has unofficially presided over the question of forfeiture since, no matter what crime a recipient committed, he should not forfeit his award. That said, the amendment to the royal warrant in 1920 stated that only treason, cowardice, felony, or any infamous crime should thereafter qualify for forfeiture. What Robert Smith was accused of more than qualifies. Indeed, what Robert Smith is accused of far exceeds any of the actions for which a Victoria Cross was forfeited. None of those who forfeited their Victoria Cross were accused of murder. Assault seems the closest, and the details of that account, Bambrick's, seem to make it certain he was an innocent man. The most common crime of those recipients who forfeited their medal was in fact theft. We can also note how many of the men who forfeited their medals were Irish, and for how many, including several who did not forfeit their medals, how drunkenness and mental health issues were clearly an issue in later life. This is not, as many might argue, a recent phenomenon. The lack of proper care for veterans, which unfortunately continues to this day, can be seen in the fates of many soldiers during the 19th century, even those men held up to the highest standards of bravery. Despite the seriousness of the crimes for which men forfeited their Victoria Cross in the past, no recipient was ever accused of murdering civilians whilst on campaign, or of committing a war crime. King George V's comment may have meant that no man has since forfeited their medal, and tracing the activities of Victoria Cross recipients Since for potential criminal activity which might have led to such a forfeiture is extremely difficult, what makes the situation of Ben Roberts-Smith even more complicated still is the creation of the Victoria Cross for Australia as a separate award in 1991. As the 20th century was coming to a close, 3 Commonwealth countries decided that they would create their own Victoria Cross Awards: Australia in 1991, Canada in 1993, and New Zealand in 1999. No Canadian has been awarded their country's highest honour, but 1 New Zealander and 5 Australians, 2 posthumously, have received theirs. The letters patent which created the Victoria Cross for Australia were signed by Queen Elizabeth II on January 15, 1991. The regulations for the Victoria Cross for Australia were issued at the same time and did not copy all of the clauses from the original Victoria Cross verbatim. They did, however, include a clause, 12, for the cancellation of the award, which stated 12.1. The Governor-General may cancel an award of the decoration and may reinstate an award so cancelled. 2. Where an award of the decoration is cancelled, the name of the person to whom the award was made shall be erased from the register, and the person shall return the decoration to the registrar. Although there is none of the precision here as there is in the original clause 15, the principles which guided that original clause are clearly appealed to, in the idea that the award of a Victoria Cross for Australia can be cancelled. What is more, despite the fact that there has been no forfeiture of a Victoria Cross since 1908, and in light of the attitude of King George V in 1920, the clause allowing for the cancellation of the award was still included in 1991. It would seem that the idea behind including such a clause in 1991 was that it could be foreseen that a recipient of the award could perceivably commit an act thereafter which would or should cause their award to be cancelled. What is more, unlike the original Victoria Cross warrant and the subsequent amendments, the Australian warrant is much more open-ended. No conduct is specified to qualify for a cancellation. We might assume that the original Victoria Cross warrant and its amendments provided guiding principles in this matter, however, in which case the most recent amendment stating that only treason, cowardice, felony, or any infamous crime would qualify as an overriding principle. Unlike the forfeitures who were eventually restored to the register, the Australian warrant, however, states that any cancellation should be erased from the register. This seems to imply that it is separate from the ideas of the original Victoria Cross warrant. A further complicating factor in Ben Roberts-Smith's case is that he was awarded the Victoria Cross for actions undertaken in 2010 in Afghanistan. He was also awarded the Medal for Gallantry for actions in 2006. The accusations raised by the journalists in 2017 and 2018, however, related to Roberts-Smith's conduct from 2006 to 2012. Therefore, before and during the time in which he was awarded the Victoria Cross and his other awards, no other recipient of the Victoria Cross was ever accused of committing a crime at the same time as they were awarded their medals. Their crimes were all subsequent to their awards, some by 20 years. If due process is followed and Roberts-Smith is accused and then found guilty of the crimes of which he is accused in a criminal trial, and there is no guarantee such a trial will go ahead, what does that do for the undeniably brave actions he undertook at the same time as perpetrating war crimes? The revelations about the conduct of members of the Australian SAS in Afghanistan contained in the Brereton report and the accusations made against Victoria Cross recipient Ben Roberts-Smith therefore require careful consideration. The loss of Roberts-Smith's defamation case against various news bodies has also brought the debate over whether he should be investigated, charged, or stripped of his award back to the forefront. Calls for the removal of his medal and uniform from display in the Australian War Memorial in Canberra have already been made. What Clause 12 allows, however, is a careful consideration of the matter, not a knee-jerk reaction to a civil defamation. Robert Smith has not been charged with any crime in either the military or civil justice system. He has had no trial, and he has not been convicted of any crime. He has maintained his innocence, using the forfeitures of the past and the original Clause 15. He would need to be convicted of a criminal act first, before any debate or consideration of whether he should have his Victoria Cross cancelled could be undertaken. It should be pointed out, however, that the clause of the letters patent for the Victoria Cross for Australia, as written, does not require this. It states only that the Governor-General may cancel the award. Unlike the original Victoria Cross, no discussion by Parliament is required. The annuity, the Victoria Cross allowance, would also be cancelled. Currently it is an annual payment of $5,068 paid in September each year. This is linked to the Australian Consumer Price Index, rising from $3,230 in 2005. When the accusations against Robert Smith first came to light, there were speeches made that our heroes should not be brought down or their actions questioned. This seems to have gotten things around the wrong way. Our heroes should be unimpeachable because their conduct is beyond reproach, not because they are above the law and that they can have committed any act without needing to ever be accountable for those actions. As we have seen with the recent fall from grace of several figures formerly held up as heroes, and where they have rightfully been held accountable for their actions, we need to question the whole nature of what a hero is. They should not be someone who can do what they want and get away with it. They should be someone who selflessly performs deeds which benefit others. They should be irreproachable, not hiding some dark secret, or to be found to have committed some unspeakable foul act. When we frame the definition of a hero in such a way, the idea of who the heroes in our lives are and who they should be changes entirely. That said, our heroes should not be torn down out of petty jealousy or spite, as seems to be the case with at least one Victoria Cross forfeiture, brought down just because they are seen as heroes and subject to the worst combination of tall poppy syndrome and trial by social media. Thorough investigation is required, and if the circumstances warrant, charges laid and trials held, and the verdict accepted. What the media circus actually makes impossible, however, is a fair trial. Finding unbiased jurors is now nigh on impossible. The conviction by social media makes actual judicial due diligence very difficult. The writers of the original Clause 15 would never have conceived and would never have envisaged that recipients would be accused of war crimes or the torture and murder of innocent civilians, however. If Ben Robert Smith is charged and found guilty of the crimes of which he is accused, then his Victoria Cross should be cancelled in accordance with Clause 12 of the regulations of the Victoria Cross for Australia. It pays to remember, however, that, currently, these accusations have only been made in relation to a civil defamation suit and across various media, television, newspaper, and social media. Even the attitude of King George V and the communication between him and Winston Churchill, that after 1920 forfeitures would only be considered for treason, cowardice, felony, or of any infamous crime, would mean a Robert Smith found guilty of such crimes should forfeit his award. First, however, he must be accused, tried and found guilty. A trial by social media and public outcry is utterly insufficient, and if the Governor-General were to react to these trials by the media and cancel his award, it would be a miscarriage of justice. If Robert Smith is brought to trial, and that is not guaranteed, the requirements for a criminal prosecution far outweigh those necessary for a civil defamation, and found guilty after due process, his continuing to hold the honour of the Victoria Cross for Australia would indeed bring the award into disrepute, the SAS into further disrepute, and the integrity of the entirety of the Australian Armed Forces into question. But first he must be allowed the full benefit of the process of law. And that brings us to the conclusion of this amazing three-parter on Valour Lost. Thanks, Murray, for writing that for us. If you'd like to have a go at writing an episode for us, or you want to contact us and give us an idea for a subject that you think we've not covered yet, then just drop us a line, info@thehistorynetwork.org for that. And once again, please do consider becoming a patron of the podcast at patreon.com/thehistorynetwork. Once again, thank you to all our patrons who make this podcast possible. Thanks again for listening. You've been listening to the historynetwork.org podcast, written by Murray Darm, read by Nick Barker.